So our next guests are John Volodukis and Dr. Rubin. I think both of them should be joining us right there on cue. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Gentlemen, how you doing? I was going to grow a beard, but John, I thought, you should be the only one with a spectacular beard, right?
Yeah, so, I've got the plague beard going. It's enough for both of us.
Well, John, while I start to introduce you both, can you just present yourself?
I'm doing it now.
Make sure you can do that. Just a little bit of background. John and I have gone, and I mean, we've been in higher ed 30 plus years. So we've worked together, we collaborate together. We're on phone calls on Saturdays on the most nonsense stuff that, most people wouldn't sit around and talk about. And so, John, thank you for joining me. And Dr. Rubin, I know that you and John work closely, and I'm excited about this discussion. Adaptive planning in this time is such a critical piece for enrollment, for financial planning, for rethinking what curriculum should look like, all that kind of stuff. When the pandemic hit, John was one of the first people I went and reached out to and said, how are we going to have schools start to plan the pandemic, right? This is when everyone just thought, oh, it's going to be a few weeks of stuff. We kind of knew that this is going to really snowball into a lot of different directions, and planning is going to be a big part of it. So Dr. Rubin is, if you want to just scroll up really quick, John. Dr. Rubin is from University of Rutgers University. He is the founder and senior university fellow at the University of Rutgers Center of Organization Leadership. He and John put a great presentation on, and so John suggested that we should do this on this session. John, of course, is VP of Nuventive, which is a platform that is really helping schools rethink how they plan with a whole set of platforms. But really today we're here to really just talk a little bit more about, all the things that universities have to think about. The platform is of course the back end of it, but you got to start thinking about the strategy of it, right? And so John, I'm going to let you take it over and talk through it, just like you talk about everything else, and then have you dialogue a little bit. We got about 20 minutes and it's all yours.
Fantastic. Thanks, Matt. So we're going to go ahead and dive into this, and Brent, you're going to get us started, right?
Absolutely. Well, it's great to be here. I've enjoyed large parts of the meeting today. I've been able to pop in and out between various Zoom events on campus here. And what, audio okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, and it's a great opportunity to put a sport coat on too, right? That hasn't happened every day, so it's good. It's good to be here. So what we want to do today is talk a lot about planning and strategy formulation. As you've been saying, Matt, strategy formulation, not always a key component of higher education, but absolutely critical sort of post-COVID. And what's clear is that higher education is really not well geared up to do planning in a crisis situation. If you look at sort of the characteristics of planning that are familiar to us, we usually have a long-term focus in our planning. We do updates, but basically they're fueled by the need for compliance with the state, institutional reports, accreditation, and so on. Really not done so much for us, but really for accountability to others. The core never changes too much. We do fine tuning around the edges. We add, we seldom subtract. One of the great traditions of higher education is to never throw anything out, but only to add new things. Performance metrics of some use, we pay attention to them now and then. We don't expect them to change too much. And by and large, there aren't aggressive performance targets that we impose. Again, a lot of these things change in a crisis situation. Data analysis looks to the past, not to the future. Not so much attention to upstream predictors as much as to where things have been. And as we well know, decision-making is notoriously slow and distributed, and who can figure out where many decisions are made, particularly in the large institutions. And I think a lot of this is so well captured by this quote from a provost of a large state university system who says our planning process led to departments reviewing their data at the end of the cycle, then writing an apology for why they didn't hit any of the targets, coming up with new goals, then ignoring them while they move to the next update. So, higher ed as we know it. Let me turn this over now to John for a bit to take us to the next step here.
Sure, thanks, Brent. So as we started working with folks, as Matt mentioned, right, I've been working with a lot of institutions in trying to think about how do they quickly change direction to deal with what's going on in the COVID crisis and become more adaptive. And one of the things that I saw is a lot of the schools that I started talking to took this same approach that they would use to build a 10-year strategic plan or write an accreditation document and use that for trying to come up with a plan for a crisis situation where everything was changing. And they'd write 200-page detailed back-to-campus plans that needed to be approved by their state system, right? They'd focus on trying to maintain normal, as the previous speakers and the comments afterwards were talking about, right? How do we get students back on campus? How do we get them back in the classroom, right? Rather than thinking about how should this work given the situation that's going on. A lot of short-term thinking. Initially, people thought, this is really about, a lockdown for 4 weeks, then we're going to be back to business as usual, right? And weren't really thinking about what are the financial implications, what are the logistical implications, what are the personal implications on our students, our faculty, everybody else who's involved in these processes. And then as we saw in the news, as fall semester kicked off, people really scrambled to adjust as reality didn't align with those assumptions. One quick story I'll tell, I was working with a school, a community college in a big state university system, right? And they were using the Nuventive product to manage their COVID plan. And as we sat down to start setting it up, they gave me one of these big monolithic plans and said, here, set this up for us. I said, okay, well, how does the plan work? Where are all your scenarios, right? What are you going to do if you have an outbreak on campus? Oh, right. We hadn't really thought of that. What are you going to do if, some percentage of your faculty get sick and can't work? Oh, we didn't really think of that, right? How are you going to measure how things are going? Oh, we don't have good measures, right? But we bought masks and hand sanitizer, everything's good, right? And so, we really had to think about how do you come up with an adaptive plan? And I'm going to bring up a quote from my friend, the general here. So this is a quote that I really like to use when it comes to planning. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? You can sit down, you can think about all of these plans, but as soon as you put that plan into action, things change, right? Some of your assumptions might have been wrong. Some external factor happens, like the COVID epidemic, right? Where we have to say, things have changed. How do we react to it, right? And the people who are gonna come out ahead are the people who can see what's coming, right? By making good use of information, forward-looking information, by being able to adapt quickly, right? And being able to say, how do I really make how do I turn on a dime, right? Or at least turn relatively quickly for an institution the size of a large university and be able to do things differently. So as we move forward, right, we say, as we saw this fall, schools that didn't have adaptive plans really had to take some dramatic steps, and a lot of those seemed very reactive, right? A number of institutions, a week after reopening their doors, turned around and sent everybody home. We had others that imposed on-campus lockdowns with students locked in their dorm rooms, only able to come out to get food, right? That certainly wasn't anybody's plan going into the pandemic, and they didn't really have processes to deal with that. By contrast, we've seen a lot of examples of leading practices too, with institutions that were really able to react quickly and had good scenario-based plans in place. So when something did happen and they said, oh, we noticed that a few students on campus have gotten infected. There was an article about the University of Arizona earlier this year where they were testing the sewage coming out of each of their dorms, right? And it gave them the ability to detect infections before they would show up on PCR tests. So they were able to find out that, hey, 2 students in this dorm were infected. They were able to find them, move them into quarantine, and avoid a major outbreak, right? That kind of planning and being able to say, we had a plan in place for what we were going to do if that happened. We had a method of getting the data we needed and to use it to make a quick decision, right? So very good examples there of how, of how some institutions had to be reactive while others were proactive and were able to execute their plans. So moving forward, a little further here. So some of the realities at the present time that are really leading to more of the need for adaptive planning, and I won't read all of these in the interest of time, but a couple that I wanted to point out. Right, pervasive disruption. This isn't the kind of thing that higher ed's ever had to deal with before. I was talking with the executive vice president of the school in Houston, and he said, we deal with crisis planning every year. We have hurricanes, they come through. Some number of our buildings get flooded. We might lose power. Some of our students are dealing with a temporary crisis, but we know it's going to be over in a few weeks. We know what to do. We can shift resources from one side of the campus to the other, right? And we can make everything work. This is a different type of environment. Huge financial pressures. A lot of the other panelists have talked about that today. I won't go into it in detail. The speed of change is something we haven't really seen in higher education before, right? Higher education, as we all know, is a very slow-moving industry by comparison to a lot of others. And really, a lot of our core assumptions are being challenged. I already mentioned kind of the grasping for normal, right? People trying to come back to, how do we get back to business as usual? Rethinking of value, I think, is a big issue that people need to consider as students start to question, is the money that I'm paying for this really worthwhile if I don't get to be on campus and see my friends and go to parties and access on-campus services and go see football games and all of these kinds of things? That's leading to a rethinking of value and a rethinking of individual values as well. Do I really want to go away to school, or do I want to stay home near my family? Right. So a lot of these kinds of things are really leading to challenges that we have to think about in retaining the students we have and in filling our incoming classes for the next few years. Right. And then finally, thinking about higher ed, unless you run a medical center, really isn't usually about making life or death decisions. Right. And in the pandemic environment, that's something else people have had to grapple with. Right. The decisions you're making really impact that. And as Brent said at the beginning, a lot of institutions really have had limited experience in preparing for or addressing this kind of rapidly changing, turbulent environment and this kind of widespread disruption. I won't read through the statistics I put on the page here. They're here for review, but just to show, obviously the disruption leads to some key issues. Big declines in enrollment, we all know that. Huge financial losses, changes in modality, right, and lots of other things that are really driving students to or rather institutions to have to rethink the way they do things. And Brent came up with this this line here, back to the past or back to the future, right? Is the goal of coming out of this cycle to get back to the way things used to be, or as the previous speaker was discussing, right? Is this really a catalyst for innovation? Can we be rethinking the way that we address the issues that are facing the industry? And so again, a number of changes here that we really need to be thinking about as we move forward, and how is this going to impact our business, not just this current year, right? This wasn't a 4-week shutdown. This wasn't something that just affected fall 2020. It's certainly going to affect the spring. As we start to recruit next year's classes, it's going to impact that. The financial shortfalls are going to ripple through a lot of institutions for years. And we need to think about how do we make all of this work in that, and still be able to deliver a meaningful education to our students.
So our goal is adaptive planning, right? And we're really talking here going forward about review, reimagination, or renewal. There are probably some other words with the prefix re that could also apply. But we narrowed this down to, well, we thought it would be 10, but it turns out it's 11. We probably could have had 15, but we did our best to keep this succinct. So we just run through a few of these. I won't read them all, but fundamental here is the need for pervasive review and reconsideration across the institution to align with crisis plans and also to identify what are the fundamental questions we need to address. We'll have a little bit more to say about that in a moment. Of course, it goes without saying, rapid information-based decision-making is critical. Technology comes in here in a very fundamental way, as does scenario planning and contingency planning. Two things we haven't really done so much of in higher education, particularly in the academic side. Some of the business areas, yes, but My background is primarily in the academic side and not very familiar with even talking about these things, right? So then also there's the issue of access to timely, relevant, and forward-looking information for all decision makers. Again, technology plays a key role there. And another area where technology has been critical, and we've done a pretty good job of innovating, is the substituting with alternatives for face-to-face interaction, for meetings, for contemplation, and with minimal time constraints. I don't know, is it 4 or 6 Zoom meetings or WebEx meetings a day? That seems to be the norm for me, and probably for nearly everybody in higher education and working in any sector these days. Now, I think a really critical point here is that we're really well set up for continuous improvement in higher education. We've been promoting the CQI model for a long time. Baldrige, which I'll talk about again in a minute, has been fundamental to the influence of continuous improvement thinking. Accrediting models promote that, but continuous improvement's not really what we need at this point, at least not for most institutions. What we need is actually transformational improvement. And that's a bit of a different challenge, as I think we all realize, where strategy formulation comes in a very critical way, as does change leadership. Again, something that we've talked a lot about in higher education, but my observation is, for all that we talk and all the programs that there are and all the writing about that, some of which I've done myself, we're still not too good at that. And this is a time where those skills are very much in need. Feedback across the organization from various stakeholders and constituencies. I think earlier, Matt made the statement, which I found was fascinating, that the present crisis provides a license to change. And while I agree with that, I also think it's a mandated situation to engage people as we execute that license. Because looking particularly at the academic side of institutions, I think there are great costs associated with moving too quickly in an autocratic, directive kind of way without engaging faculty. It's kind of well known that there was never a good idea any faculty member could ever accept if they didn't have a chance to give voice or reaction to it. So, I mean, I think the stakeholder engagement piece and the two-way interaction is critical. I also think that we've got to move past traditions of the past and identify areas for experimentation. And then the 11th, and it's the preface to the framework below, is to utilize frameworks and tools that help us do this. The EHE model, which is referred to here, some of you may recognize as an adaptation of the Malcolm Baldrige framework. I've been working on this adaptation for over 10 years now. I was actually on the team that developed the education adaptation of Baldrige, but what we felt we needed to do is come up with a higher education version of this. So this is a model that we used at Rutgers generally, and many institutions and many other schools have used it as well over the past years, to identify the critical components of the higher ed system, to figure out how we can drill down into each of these, look at the key issues that come into play for each, look at critical interactions, look at issues of alignment. And what we've done most recently, and I'm pleased to acknowledge the work of Nuventive in sponsoring a white paper that I did that transforms this model for looking at how this would apply, the Baldrige higher education model would apply in reimagination and renewal post-COVID-19. And we have a paper you'll be able to access if you are interested in that later. But there's a lot that we could say if we had time about this model and the importance of each one of these components and the fundamental questions that come up in each category that are, as I see it, absolutely critical for formulating strategy and forward-looking plans to return to a future that's not like the old one, but is in many ways better, but certainly will be different.
Great, thanks, Brent. And one other thing that I'll bring up here that highlights some of these points too is just I have one picture from a product that Nuventive brought out to help our customers manage their way through this crisis. And part of the idea here, and this is just a screenshot, but the idea is, and this resonates with some things that I heard in an earlier presentation this morning about people flooded with data, not sure where to look. and being able to build feedback loops from people to say, what am I seeing in the data? What am I going to do with it? So what we've done here is really, developed a place where we can bring in any information people might want to look at, whether it's external to the institution, coming from internal systems, news articles, whatever it is, putting that side by side with the, what is it people are doing? Right, let's come up with our plans, and we can do that from an institutional perspective. We can do that from a bottoms-up perspective, but then we can allow people to manage that and provide feedback and look at that information to make good decisions. Put that information all in front of people to give them a way to really accelerate what they're learning, making information-based decisions, putting those forward. And that's kind of, it's a technology tool that helps with all the rest of this, which is why I left it for the end, right? You don't lead with the technology, but to be able to execute some of these things in an effective way, technology really helps. And so with some closing thoughts here, obviously crisis also presents an opportunity. We heard that from the previous speaker. I'm going to repeat that point, not only because it's on the slide, because I think it's it's absolutely the right message here, right? We have a light at the end of the tunnel now. We're starting to see some vaccines. We're starting to see some treatments that are effective. We're going to be coming out of this crisis, right? But as we said, the crisis is going to continue to percolate through our institutions for a while, and thinking about how do we really address that, and how do we come out of this stronger than we were before. Good information is critical to making good decisions. We need to question some of our core assumptions. We need to plan for the situation at hand and align that to our long-term view, right? And we need to get contributions from across the campus, as Brent said, right, to continuously improve. A top-down approach isn't going to yield sustainable results in a higher education culture. So, as Brent mentioned, he put together a really nice white paper talking about how to apply some of this to adaptive planning. It's available from the, if you send an email to that email address, we'll be happy to send it for you. And thank you, everybody, for your time. We're happy to take some questions.
All right, I'm looking any questions. There's no question specific to your topic here. Let me, the thing that I as you look at the pandemic and, just going through this, what are a couple of things that schools should be thinking about, not necessarily for the upcoming term, but planning even just beyond that? I think because remember, in one of my discussions, I pushed back and said, what is the strategy, right? Because if you don't have a strategy, you can't lay out what the steps are. What are some of the strategies going even beyond the next term that schools should be thinking about?
Let me take a stab at that. I think one of the critical issues in strategy formulation is to figure out not how to add new things, but what should be retained, what should be closed down, what should be expanded, what should be put on pause. But you can't do that without developing a clear set of criteria. Yeah. And that's also something that often is missing. So criteria such as mission centrality, revenue implications, cost implications, stakeholder need, and so on. And you can envision a process where you develop a matrix that has programs on one axis and services on that axis, and on the other axis, critical criteria. And you apply the strategy to decide which things to build and grow out, which things to close down, which new things to add, and so on. And that sort of systematic thought and where you drill down around strategy, that's not common to higher ed.
Yeah. So Dr. Rubin, looking at all these things that we've been doing for a long time, and then having to have some uncomfortable conversations, right? That is some of the things that you're saying you got to have is, hey, what we've been doing, we may have to revisit, and that program or that course or whatever the criteria that we have to rethink. I think that's what you're saying is like you need to have data around it. You need to make some informed decisions around it, and then drive that transformation, knowing that you may have to sunset something to allow you to have an exponential trajectory to do something else. Is that a good?
Absolutely. And I think, the information piece is critical, and the strategy piece, and the leadership comes in, I think, both in terms of driving and envisioning change. But I want to emphasize again that critical role leadership needs to play in engaging particularly campus constituencies, in the changes that are being advocated. Because it is quite amazing how effective campus constituencies can be in stalling change if they really want to resist.
Yeah. And actually that leads to, I saw somebody pop a question up in the Q&A. I don't know if you see that, Brent, that says, how do you get faculty buy-in in this type of planning? Which really leads to that. I know you talked about it. So you want to take a shot at that one?
I will. I think in general, you have to have regular and repetitive communication where you alert people and engage them in an understanding of what the needs are, what the problems are, exploring alternative solutions, and just keeping them in the loop sort of all the way along. I think probably the parallel is with inoculations that we're talking about here, and vaccinations. You can't just assume that everybody will instantly recognize the need and be ready to take that vaccination if they're not brought along with an understanding, so that they become part of the problem, they own some of the solutions, and they see it as a necessary step for their own future and their own survival, really.
Yeah, I'll tack on to that too. One of the things that I found pretty successful is if you can set the high level direction, because in response to Matt's question, right, one of the things that I would say there is, there's two pieces to moving forward, right? One is we have to stop any leaks in the ship, right? And part of doing that is exactly what Brent said, right? We need to rethink what we're doing. Can we cut back some services? Are there some new things we can add, new ways of generating revenue? We also need to look at, as others were talking about earlier, what are our constituents looking for now? Has the world changed, right? Are employers seeking something else from us? The gentleman from Salesforce this morning spent a lot of time talking about student preferences, right? And how to, what is it students want? So we've got to rethink that. So we've kind of got to stabilize, and then we've also got to think about what we want to be when we grow up here. And as we do that, we can then come out of that and say, we have some high level things that we think we need to do as an institution, right? And depending on how urgent those are, those might be more prescriptive than collaborative, right? If we're leaking money like a sieve, we need to patch those holes. We can't necessarily wait and collaborate on that. If our enrollment's down 20%, we've got to do something about that. But I think what you can do is you can say, we have this, these are the high level things we have to do. These are the metrics that we need to hit. What's everyone going to do about it, right? Give them a way to now say, okay, in my part of the world, right, in the enrollment management office, I'm going to do X. In the financial aid office, I'm going to do Y. In the English department, we're going to do these three things. And, all of that being aligned back and informed by the same sets of information and aligned back to those broad institutional goals. So you can lay out the targets and say, this is where we're going, help us get there. Right? How are we going to do this, and be able to use that to move it forward?
Yeah,
and I think the education piece is critical too, because, just looking at the realities that I see, deans and directors and so on, they understand how much money might be lost, how many jobs might be at stake, even how at some institutions, the very existence of the institution might be challenged. But how is that understood by others throughout the system? It's not that you need to ask their opinion or ask them to accept it, but this educational process is pretty important. And I would, especially if you're a campus that has unionization, that's a whole other thing we could spend a lot of time on. But you do want everybody to be somewhat understanding of the kind of solutions that are being suggested, proposed, and adopted.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Rubin. John, thanks a lot. We are about to go into a discussion around the community college and the opportunity that it is going to present to many people moving forward. And Dr. Glasper, Dr. Wilson, and Chancellor Lee Lambert from Pima College is coming on. They're going to be joining me on the stage. But really, a lot of the adaptive planning that you're speaking of will actually be very valuable to many of the community colleges that start to rethink what their offering is, what industries are they going into, and so forth like that.